Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to World History. Today we're going to talk about the effect of the Cold War on Latin America, bringing us up to date with a number of the Latin American countries we've talked about so far, and then looking at the ways in which this global struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union affected the countries of Latin America. So, here's our objectives for today. As you hopefully remember, Latin America pushed its independence movement or had its independence movement right during the Napoleonic era, with the whole era of Bolivar, San Martin, and in the Mexican independence movement. And one of the trends that we saw within these Latin American societies is the governments that tended to emerge after independence became very unstable, with various military leaders known as caudillos cultivating local areas of support and repeatedly overthrowing each other, really preventing Latin America from developing sort of stable governmental systems, institutional controls, cohesive policy, infrastructure, social services, stuff like that. Because there wasn't any continuity and the transfer of power was so problematic in these new Latin American republics, they really struggled to provide the sort of fertile ground in which rule of law and economic growth is going to emerge. And so these caudillos really prevented a lot of these countries from developing economically. That was coupled with the fact that during the age of imperialism, we saw economic imperialism both from the English and both from the Europeans and from the Americans. And this also, to some degree, limited Latin American countries' development. We remember this, of course, in Mexico, where we had our dictator, president, whatever you want to call him, Porfirio Diaz, run on a platform of no reelection and then repeatedly get reelected using his policy of pan o palo, or bread or stick, to reward his supporters, punish his political enemies, and push economic development by bringing in money from the United States. Because of this, Mexico remained somewhat of an economic satellite to the United States. There was some economic growth for Mexican elites, but many of the profits from these ventures, from the mining and the railroads, went to American businessmen as opposed to Mexicans. And so this led to increasing tension in Mexico until eventually Porfirio Diaz was overthrown. The extremely corrupt Mexican presidential election of 1910, Porfirio Diaz declared himself the victor again, and this led to an armed rebellion by a whole bunch of different forces, most famously Francisco Madero here. Madero is eventually going to consolidate enough of these forces and gain the power of the federal army to seize power and force Porfirio Diaz into exile. But once in power, Madero is going to really struggle to unite the various revolutionary factions. Conservatives are going to hate him because he's pushing some reforms. Liberals are going to hate him because his reforms don't go far enough. And so Madero, unable to consolidate power, is going to be eventually overthrown. You're going to have armed rebellions show up against him. Emilio Zapata is going to lay out his plan of Ayala, which you should definitely read here. Take a moment, pause, and read. And this push for vast change in Mexico is going to lead to his assassination, the collapse of the government, and a multi-party civil war to try to seize power in the remains of the Porfiriato. So the Porfiriato is going to collapse, the Mexican government's going to collapse, and we're going to have a multi-party civil war between a whole bunch of different forces, including, of course, Emiliano Zapata, who's going to be pushing socialist principles, Pancho Villa, who's like half bandit, half socialist, half freedom fighter. He's going to become a darling of the Americans until he invades the United States in order to help mobilize support against him. A military strongman named Obregon is going to seize power and then be assassinated. And a guy named Carranza is also going to seize power and then be assassinated. And so during the Mexican Civil War, we're going to get a whole bunch of different forces rising to power. And it seems as if, with the Porfiriato gone, the caudillos are back, rising to power, assassinating each other, and then riding off into the sunset again. And so it seems like Mexico is going to be continuously unstable until the institutional Revolutionary Party rises to power. This is generally associated with this guy, Plutarco Calles, who is going to start up this sort of unifying party in Mexican politics. In the end, the Institutional Revolutionary Party isn't really going to stand for anything. The PRI isn't going to push any specific policies. It's basically going to be a union of Mexican elites whose goal it is to keep enough stability to keep Mexico together, to end the Civil War, and to basically keep the status quo going. And so the PRI is going to become the one party in Mexico and is going to really rule Mexican politics up until quite recently, actually. It's going to resist reforms. It's not going to push any specific ideology. And really, in the end, its main calling card is going to be it's going to provide stability for Mexico and end the cycle of civil wars and caudillos. So that's the story of Mexico. In the end, you get a revolution, you get some socialists pushing for change, but in the end, mostly Mexico's not going to change. Cuba is, of course, a very different story. Cuba became an American protectorate, sort of, under the Spanish-American War. As you hopefully remember, American forces helped overthrow the Spanish to end the Cuban independence movement. But in the aftermath, the Platt Amendment established that the United States would be able to intervene in Cuba whenever they wanted. The United States had pushed a series of handpicked dictators, with the last one being Batista here. And generally, they're going to push favorable American politics, making Cuba an ostensible banana republic. Here's Fidel Castro, the guy who eventually overthrows Batista, laying out the problem in Cuba. Obviously, having foreign landlords using Cuba as mostly a breeding ground or a cultivating plantation for raw materials does not create a lot of wealth for Cubans, and so it's going to lead to a revolutionary movement against the Cuban government. Castro is going to lead a years-long guerrilla struggle against this, unifying the Cuban people and eventually overthrowing the government, overthrowing the Cuban government and seizing control of Cuba. Some of Castro's support, of course, because this happened in the 1950s, was coming from the Soviet Union. And so in the aftermath of Castro's takeover, the United States attempted to overthrow him, sending Cuban exiles back to Cuba with tacit support from the U.S. government. There was some promise of air support as well, but Castro's intelligence network let him know that this whole Bay of Pigs invasion was going to happen. And so, in the end, the Cuban rebels were captured on the beach, revealing American involvement and tightening the connection between Cuba and the Soviet Union. This was spectacularly embarrassing for the Kennedy administration because of its horrible failure. And you'll go into this more in your U.S. history class. But geopolitically, it created enough support for Castro that he's going to become sort of the leader of these Latin American revolutionary movements. And so, as Castro states, the United States' fear was this domino theory that the Cuban Revolution was going to kick off a series of other revolutions in Latin America. And so he was concerned that regardless, despite the failure of the Bay of Pigs, the United States was going to continue to push overthrowing his regime. Khrushchev is going to use the horrible embarrassment the United States faced to justify building up the Berlin Wall, which closed off one of the key avenues from people to escape from Eastern Europe. Castro's excuse for this is it was to stop Western infiltration into communist countries, like happened in the Bay of Pigs. But in reality, it solidified Soviet control over Eastern Europe and prevented people from fleeing through Berlin, which had been one of the key pipelines to get people out of the communist world and into the capitalist one. Finally, the Cuban Revolution led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, where Castro accepted Soviet missiles to be placed in Cuba as a protection, as an insurance policy against U.S. invasion. A U-2 flight over Cuba revealed these policies, leading to an international crisis because Cuba's proximity to the United States meant that the U.S.'s warning time for being hit with a ballistic missile went down to almost nothing. The United States then established a blockade around Cuba, which was in order to prevent needed components from coming to Cuba to bring the missiles online. The Soviets then sent battleships and warships towards this U.S. blockade, and there was this real sense that if these two sides met, the conflict could escalate and could lead to general war between the capitalist and communist worlds. Because of this policy of brinksmanship, Khrushchev reached out to Kennedy. One of the problems that they were facing, so take a moment and read Khrushchev's message to Kennedy. One of the problems that these two sides were facing is there were no direct lines of communication between the US and the Soviet Union. We had to find neutral ambassadors, pass notes, have translators on hand. Oftentimes, the responses would take hours in order to get back and forth between the two sides. And in an incredibly volatile situation, this lack of communication was really problematic. Also, both sides' willingness to potentially expand their response and potentially use nuclear weapons made this an incredibly dangerous situation, bringing us almost to the point of nuclear annihilation. As my father once told me, his sixth grade teacher told him to enjoy the weekend during October of 1962, noting that it would probably be his last one on Earth. In the end, the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis is mostly on Khrushchev. He's going to agree to remove the Cuban missiles in response for a U.S. promise not to invade Cuba. This also leads both sides to try to come to a closer understanding about limiting the use of nuclear weapons and creating clearer communication lines between the two sides. The United States is also going to agree to scrap their missiles in Turkey, which were outdated. The United States had missiles in Turkey close to the Soviet Union. This was a secret part of the agreement, was the U.S. would also remove missiles from Turkey, which we no longer needed. And there was a direct telegraph line established between Moscow and Washington, making sure that both sides could communicate instantaneously in case of a sort of a global emergency. As far as other examples here, the Costa Rican government faced a rebellion by communist backed forces, but American support for Costa Rica led them to brutally suppress this rebellion, and Costa Rica remained sort of a capitalist banana republic on the side of the United States. Our support for dictators in Costa Rica has led to, in general, stability within Costa Rica, although there's some arguments about, again, economic imperialism and lack of opportunity for Costa Ricans. But Costa Rica remains more or less a close government, closely tied to the United States, and they've got a relatively stable republic today. In Nicaragua, our handpicked dictator was overthrown by a group called the Sandinistas, a leftist backed group which attempted to bring in more socialist and land reform policies in Nicaragua in the late 1970s. The United States, because of this, funded a group called the Contras, which were anti communist guerrillas, leading to an unbelievably brutal civil war in Nicaragua in the 1980s. And so the effect on Nicaragua is lasting, and the damage done by this civil war is still being felt to this day. So that brings us to the end of Latin America. In Mexico, we saw a general failure of reform, leading to, for the most part, stability. In Cuba, a communist revolution led to a communist government and the almost destruction of the world. In Nicaragua, we also got a civil war. But Costa Rica, the communist movement was crushed, leading to, a lack of economic opportunity for some Costa Ricans, but in general, a more stable government. So hopefully you can respond to these prompts, and thank you for listening.